Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today we're going to talk about some biblical stories, actually one biblical story about Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with the story. If you're not, in a nutshell, the Bible describes an event in which these two cities were a victim of God's wrath, and they basically kind of describes an explosion and then people turning into pillars of salt, and the whole area is just flattened for generations until thousands of years later it's repopulated and stuff like that. These team of investigators, for years now, not this specific team, but I mean there's been a lot of speculation and a lot of scientists looking into what really happened. Some people thought it was like early nuclear warfare. Some people thought it was extraterrestrials, but the most compelling argument and suggestion was that it was a comet impact. This article goes over this multi-disciplinary team of scientists go through all the evidence that would support some impact hypothesis, so to speak, that would have happened during this time 3,700 years ago or 1700 BC, around there. I think it's pretty compelling, some of the circumstances that they describe, some of the evidence that they have, and then also some of the lines from the Bible or seem to be consistent with what the scientists are talking about. Let's just get into it, and first let's talk about one of the events that they compare it to often, which is the Tunguska event. So in 1908, Tunguska, it's basically a part of Siberia that was uninhabited. There was a comet that blew up in Earth's atmosphere, and although there's no crater because it didn't technically hit the ground, it blew up in the air and it just flattened, I don't know how many square miles, but a ton of uninhabited land was just literally flattened. The trees were flat. Everything within that blast radius was just done. So luckily there were no people there. But if that were to happen on top of, say, a big city like New York, Dallas or something like that, Los Angeles, everyone for sure. The scientists use that event to help preface their hypothesis that something similar happened. And it wasn't necessarily as big as Tunguska. I mean, Tunguska wasn't that big, but it caused a bunch of damage. The one that they're proposing that destroyed Sodom and all the cities around it, such as Gomorrah, that one actually was a little bit smaller than Tunguska. But the difference was there were people living there, and not just people, but a highly successful agricultural-based civilization was living there, and they just all got wiped off the map, right next to the Dead Sea. So that's an interesting comparison that they make. So they use this massive explosion hypothesis, reminiscent of the Tunguska. Oh yeah, 2,000 square kilometers was Tunguska, basically. That's a lot. And it's crazy that no one was living there. But I think the Tunguska event happened in June 30th, 1908. So that's around the time, I think, of the Perseids. So I mentioned this in another video, that the Perseids... No, I think I'm wrong. But anyway, there was a meteor shower, and we always cross this meteor shower every year, and then every year there's a chance that one of those objects will get sucked into Earth's orbit and hit us. Anyway, the object in Tunguska was one such of those, and I think with a certain amount of time, people, if they pay attention to the stars, they can kind of see it coming. So that's probably why, that's one of the reasons why people think Halloween started, is because around Halloween there was actually a life-killing event, a cosmic event that happens on Earth. Every Halloween we're in danger of that. I mean, that's one. I don't know how scientifically correct that is, but I've heard that story of Halloween's origins tracing to some object hitting the Earth. But anyway, the ancients very well knew that there were objects that come into contact with Earth and kill a lot of things, because it happened often enough that it eventually got absorbed into their legend, And the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, according to these scholars and scientists alike, think that's also what happened. And then they attached a lot of moral lessons in there as well, because supposedly Sodom was home to these not hedonistic, but it was one of those stories where they failed to wear the crown of prosperity on their heads with balance and respect. Basically, they let shit get out of hand, and then God smote them from the earth because they were immoral, among other things. That's the story in a nutshell. I'm sure there's a lot of other details I'm forgetting, but remember, I'm trying to make this a 20 to 30 minute video, so please bear with me. But you guys get the gist of what I'm talking about. They used the Tunguska explosion as a model to explain the equally curious end to a thriving civilization that lived for thousands of years in a plain near the Dead Sea. This is true. So if you guys take a look at this map, you see the Sea of Galilee, and then the Jordan River, and then all the way down to the Dead Sea to the south. So Tal El Hammam is the excavation site here, as well as Kikar region here. And this is the region in question where Sodom must have, according to these scientists, Sodom must have been located somewhere around here, because it fits the biblical description of a highly successful plain, and the conditions are correct for it because there's a water source. There's a black matte layer, which we'll get into later, that is indicative of some sort of impact. And also the soil was very fertile at the time, and then it was stripped. Well, anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the project is called the Tal El Hammam Excavation Project, and the head guy is Dr. Silva, Philip J. Sylvia. So Dr. Sylvia, he presented this paper, Middle Gore Event, Catastrophic Termination of a Bronze Age Civilization. I've tried to get this paper I tried to just use this instead of this article, but I had to pay some money for it and I had to sign up. I read some snippets of it, but I couldn't get the whole thing in its entirety. And I guess that's a good thing, because the whole paper is huge and I don't think I could get through all of it in one video. The paper's abstract discusses evidence of a high heat explosive event north of the Dead Sea that instantaneously devastated approximately 500 square kilometers. The explosion would have wiped out all civilization in the affected area. So Tunguska was 2,000 square kilometers, so this is only a quarter of the strength of Tunguska. And Tunguska is considered to be pretty weak compared to other things, other explosions, just to keep that in mind. The explosion would have wiped out all civilization in the affected area, including Middle Bronze Age cities and towns. So Sodom would be a Middle Bronze Age city, as well as Gomorrah, because Gomorrah was also a town in the surrounding area. It would have, according to Sylvia, it would have instantly killed the estimated 40 to 65,000 people who inhabited Middle Gore, a 25-kilometer wide circular plain in Jordan, which is, I think this is here, right here. So 25 kilometers, so that's really not that big compared to the blast radius of 500 kilometers squared. And so they're seeking to prove that this happened, this explosive north event, and that's what this evidence is going to be pointing toward as we continue. In the Bible, they describe Sodom as having fertile soil. So the fertile soil here would have been stripped of nutrients naturally by the high heat, which would take thousands of years, or hundreds of years rather, to get those nutrients back in. Waves of the Dead Sea's briny and hydride salts would have tsunami-like washed over the surrounding area. So the Dead Sea is notoriously known for the high salt content. I've never gone myself, but I've had friends send me pictures of them going to the Dead Sea and just floating like nothing, because it provides buoyancy that a lesser saline content water would provide. Again, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it says that people disappeared, they turned into pillars of salt. This might have something to do with that description. After the explosion, the fallout caused hot, strong winds, deposited a rain of mineral grains, which have been found on pottery found at the site Tel El Hammam. So that's kind of a smoking gun to me, in a way, because the pottery has, why would this pottery have a rain of mineral grains when other pottery in other parts of Israel and Jordan didn't have this? So that's maybe it's not so much a smoking gun, but it's a huge piece of the puzzle, I think. Where did that come from, 5 large sites in the region which have been also excavated offers additional evidence of an immediate end to settlement at the same time of the proposed Tal el-Hammam disaster. According to Science News, radiocarbon dating of organic archaeological evidence has shown that structures' mud brick walls suddenly disappeared around 3,700 years ago, leaving only stone foundations. I did a previous episode on, because they're always finding more and more stuff almost weekly in Israel and that part of the West Bank and Jordan, that area. They're always finding a bunch of stuff. And there was this one article that talked about these stone foundations, and there was a bunch of them clumped together indicating a city or a town. This organic this organic material, the mud brick walls, would be the first to go if there was an explosion like that. The stone, if it's grounded correctly, it's logical that it would stick around, which it did in these sites. I don't know if these sites are related, but they're within that vicinity near the Dead Sea, so it would make sense. So that's also an interesting piece of, if not evidence, a significant detail supporting the evidence that there was some sort of explosion or catastrophic event that literally deleted those houses from existence. So they look at other potsherds from the same time, and they experienced temperatures high enough to transform them to glass. It must have been, for a moment in time, it must have been as hot as the surface of the sun when this impact happened. That's how much of a kinetic punch we're talking here. And if they did turn into glass, that does make a lot of sense. They talked about this with Göbekli Tepe and the Younger Dryas event, that they did find this nuclear glass 12,900 years old or something consistent with the Younger Dryas impact event hypothesis. So it makes sense that they would find glass in this proposal as well. So this study was born of a historical riddle that the most productive agricultural land in the region, which had supported flourishing civilizations continuously for at least 3,000 years, should suddenly relinquish, then resist human habitation for such a long period of time, has begged investigation. So relinquish, then resist human habitation. So that means that's consistent with nuclear fallout, right? Or some sort of fallout. A bustling area that's successful in sustaining a large population and providing for the people for generations suddenly stops, and then there's no activity there for a while, for at least 600 years before more people start coming back. Why the holdup? Why didn't they start rebuilding right after? Well, that's because it was uninhabitable for a long time. Think about Chernobyl, right? Chernobyl's not even a impact event. It's just mismanagement of nuclear power, and Chernobyl to this day is not. We can't even, with our technology and how advanced we are. Maybe it's safe to assume we're more technologically advanced than the people of Sodom of that day. Still, we can't go back into Chernobyl. Same thing with Fukushima is another one. These are not impact events, yet we've totally destroyed the land long enough. My point is that it is possible for an area to be uninhabited for long periods of time. That shouldn't be swept under the rug, so to speak. So this group of scientists, they analyze, I don't want to go through, I mean, they're from all over the place. New Mexico Tech, North Arizona University, NC State, Elizabeth City State University, DePaul University, Trinity Southwest, the Comet Research Group, and Los Alamos National Laboratory. So this star-studded cast of people, they analyze samples from 12 seasons of excavations at Tel el-Hammam and conclude that the most logical explanation for the settlement's demise was a meteor explosion. This is after analyzing everything. This paper is basically the culmination of their findings. So it surveys the multiple lines of evidence that collectively suggest a Tunguska-like cosmic airburst event that obliterated civilization. Cosmic airburst event, meaning it wasn't an impact, it didn't hit the Earth. It exploded in the air, which can still devastate land, as evidenced by the Tunguska event itself. They call this place the Middle Gore, the 25-kilometer diameter circular plane, Middle Gore, I guess. There's a lot of different names. 1700 BCE or 3700 years before present is the time frame that they're giving. Based on the archaeological evidence, it took 600 years to recover. I already went over that. This is actually cell phone footage of the 2013 Ural Mountains meteor that went across the Ural Mountains. I'm not going to pull up the YouTube clip, but there's a ton of clips. You guys can look it up for yourself. I don't want to get pulled from YouTube, but you can see it happening live on the camera footage of this guy on the road here. I think it's dash cam actually. It's insane. And it's not even that big compared to everything else. But if you were to look at this, see this happen, if you were within distance of Sodom and you see this streaking across the sky, you would think that's the hand of God. No doubt about it. I mean, people nowadays think it's the hand of God. Zeus's thunderbolt, whatever you want to say. Goku's fireball, right? That looks like, that could, the parallels, although they're endless, but they all lead to the same thing. Something bright and huge in the sky and explodes. It's a tale as old as time itself. So they go on. Dr. Steve Collins, he reviews this article. Tal el-Hammam site is a strong candidate for the biblical city of Sodom due to a multitude of factors. So yeah, how do we know this is Sodom? The disaster and its precise location is tied to biblical references of Ha-Kikar, or idiomatically the plain. They call it the plain. And here's the famous depiction from John Martin's destruction of Sodom of Gomorrah, this painting. Very interesting here, everything on fire. This is 1852. So Collins quotes from Genesis 19:24-25. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, including all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. So in the Bible, it's describing basically what I described earlier in the study. The soil was stripped of nutrients, so nothing can grow there for a long, long time. The violent conflagration that ended occupation at Tal el-Hammam produced melted pottery, scorched foundation stones, and several feet of ash and destruction debris churned into a dark gray matrix. So this sounds like the black mat layer. The black mat layer was literally what it sounds like. It's this layer of ash and soot, this black layer in the soil, in the strata of the soil in North America, and I think some parts of Northern and Western Europe as well, as a result of this huge comet impact. And if this were the same thing, then it makes sense that if Sodom were hit by a comet, then it would leave this dark gray matrix as well. And this is in the record, in the archaeological record. So there really is a dark gray matrix. That's not made up. That's real. It's like a skid mark of a comet, basically, or a footprint rather. That's not the footprint of something that exploded in the air. And the fire just sort of burnt everything, and that's what's left. The natural causes of divine wholesale raising of the city recorded in the Bible. In a jointly authored paper between Sylvia and Collins, the civilization ending 3.7 thousand years before present, archaeological data, sample analyses, and biblical implications, the physical evidence from Tal el-Hammam and neighboring sites exhibit signs of a highly destructive, concussive, and thermal event that one might expect from what is described in Genesis 19. Genesis 19, of course, being Sodom and Gomorrah's story. An airburst yield of 10 megatons over the northeast corner of the Dead Sea would be sufficient to produce the physical damage observed 10 kilometers away at Tal el-Hammam. Note that this is only one half of the yield of Tunguska airburst event, well within recent human experience from meteoric airbursts. So yeah, so basically Samuel Gladstone, he's an atomic energy researcher. He's saying that, an airburst yield of 10 megatons would be easily, you could see that 10 kilometers away rather, and you could probably write about it later. It would be noteworthy enough to knock your socks off, your imagination, and write about it, essentially, if people were around. So if Tunguska happened over like Moscow, I mean, people would still be talking about that to this day. There'd be a bunch of religious people talking about how that's the hand of God. There'd be other people thinking it's conspiracy, someone threw a bomb on them. I mean, it could cause all kinds of insurrection. Luckily, it didn't happen. It happened in Siberia where nobody lives. But it did kill a bunch of trees and animals and stuff like that. The destruction not only of Atal al-Hammam, but also its neighbors, Gomorrah and other cities of the plain, was most likely caused by a meteoritic outburst event. Okay, so now that we've wholly established that the parallels between Sodom and the site Tal al-Hammam, let's talk about why we still talk about Sodom and Gomorrah today. Well, let's just take for granted that it did happen. Okay, this did happen. We're in 1700 BC era, Dead Sea Plain, Jordan, and ancient Israel and all that stuff. Okay, what happens in the aftermath? How do people react? Well, the massive disaster was seared into our collective cultural memory and preserved in the biblical tradition, just like the Great Flood was, right? The Great Flood, something global and worldwide happened with the flood that to this day there are flood myths all found all over in all traditions all over the earth. So this is not nearly as big as the Younger Dryas event. However, it was preserved in the biblical tradition because it happened in the heart of where the Bible's written about, essentially. So here's who says this. I think this is Collins. The memory of the destruction of Ha-Kikar, with its large population and extensive agricultural lands, was preserved in the book of Genesis and ultimately incorporated into a traditional tale that, drawing on the layer of ash that covered the destruction of one of its major cities, remembered a place consumed by fiery catastrophe from out of the heavens. Genesis 19:24. The Bible gives the city's name Sodom. Okay, so I can see how for some people this is still not enough, that they think it really was the hand of God and it wasn't some divine thing. I don't think that's the question here, though. The thing is, like, this is consistent with what happens pretty routinely in the scope of Earth's timeline. It happens pretty routinely that there are intergalactic cosmic events that affect us on Earth, and this is just one account in the Bible that it happened to affect mankind, and it's been recorded. And people, not only is it recorded in the cultural record of the Bible, but also they're attaching moral stories to it as sort of a way to educate people, in a sense, make them aware of what's possible. It's not really to strike the fear of God in them, although it does have that effect. I think more so it's kind of like a reference. I'm going to do an article tomorrow tomorrow or Thursday, about cave paintings and how they have these in these cave paintings, they have these depictions of animals. Well, these animals aren't just what was around them, although they were around them, obviously, but they also represent star systems and galaxies in the sky. So it's like a timekeeping thing for them. And some of them warn of, they've concluded now after analysis that they warn of cosmic events, and this is like 40,000 years ago. So they were keeping track of this for a long time. So the fact that Sodom may very well have been a real city. I mean, it fits all where else would people live? I don't think they would make this up. It probably was a real city, and it probably did get wiped off the face of the earth. And what happens when that happens? Like, what happens to the people when an event like that happens? Well, it makes sense that they would record it in the Bible. Anyway, I've rambled on way too long. I feel like I've been shouting into this microphone for a long time. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I had some good comments yesterday in the videos that I did respond to the video yesterday that I did respond to. But yeah, I'm interested to see the comments about this story. I'm sure a lot of you have opinions on this, and I'll talk to you guys hopefully tomorrow.